We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Welcome to the latest Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by two esteemed guests. We've got Dan Vevers of the Sunday Mail and Douglas Dickie of the Scottish Daily Express. So we're going to look at three issues this week. Number one, the race for the Scottish Labour leadership, which is pretty much the contest no one is talking about. Two, the increasing likelihood of a general election at Westminster. And three, finally, a BBC documentary in the shocking state of Glasgow. So let's kick off with Labour first. On Monday, we had the candidates confirmed. That is the MSPs Michael Marra and Joe Fagan. Before we come to them, there was the sort of really big story about fellow MSP Monica Lennon effectively getting knocked out because she did not receive the necessary number of nominations. And that has generated a bit of a backlash from people who think that it was wrong not to have a female candidate and someone on the left. Dan, do you think it looks bad that Monica Lennon was not excluded, but is not on the ballot?
Yeah, I don't think it's a great look, if I'm honest. I think you see here is a disconnect between, you could say, the parliamentary party, the establishment of the party, and its wider grassroots membership. You know, she is popular with members, she is popular with trade unions. You know, she ran Anna Sarwar a close second last time out. She's a formidable campaigner. She was in Vogue once because she actually has some name recognition. So, you know, although Monica Lennon is a Sunday Mail columnist, I'm not going all in for her, but I do think it would have been an interesting debate to have with her in it. I think Labour is at a crossroads at the moment in Scotland. You know, if they don't get their act together, you know, they're looking at a very, very grim future. And this would have been a good time to have a wide debate, a debate that brought in lots of different ideas. You know, Monica has lots of things to say about redistribution of wealth, about taxation, and I think social issues as well. And instead what we have are, if I'm being fairly candid, two blokes who most people never heard of. I think that's a bit of a shame. And I think, you know, Labour is already being ignored by the Scottish electorate. That's just going to continue during this contest, I suspect.
Doug, we'll come to the candidates in a minute, but just finally on Monica Lennon, I think the reasons for her not making the ballot are complex and varied. There's no doubt she's had personality clashes with other parliamentarians. There's maybe ideological disagreements there. Certainly on the left, there was a disagreement on the trans issue that resulted in Carol Mockin not backing her until the very last moment. Do you think, is there a danger by her not being on the ballot that they're maybe making a martyr of her?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things I'll say is I've known Monica a long time, since she was a councillor at South Lanarkshire Council, and I was a reporter on the Reformer. So I've always liked her. I've always got on well with her. But I think, you know, I might not always agree with her, but I think she's someone who's in it for the right reasons. But ultimately, I think her biggest problem was that she was the preferred candidate of the SNP and the Scottish Greens. And I think in some ways, when your opponents are picking you out as their preferred candidate, it's never going to, you know, I don't think it's ever really going to go in your favour. And from that point of view, yeah, I think the left will now hold Monica Lennon up as their champion, their kind of hard done by champion. And I think you'll see the Greens and the SNP kind of playing that up throughout the contest. And ultimately, you know, it might be between Joe Fagan and Michael Marra, but she's probably going to be the name on everyone's lips. Well, you know, everyone who's actually interested in it, because as you say, Paul, you know, this is hardly this leadership contest is hardly capturing the public's attention.
You mentioned that, Doug. I was at the Edinburgh hustings last night, and she was mentioned repeatedly.
Yeah.
Not being on the ballot. So you're probably right on that.
I mean, obviously, there's still quite a long and convoluted process we're going through. So, come the end of it, she may have been semi-forgotten about, but right now she is the kind of main, the main person, the Scottish Labour figure who's got the most public recognition, albeit that might not be as much as Scottish Labour would like. But, she completely overshadows the debate now between two guys who, if you were asked your average punter on the street, let's be honest here, won't have a clue who either of them are really. Michael Marra maybe, but Joe Fagan is something of an unknown quantity to the vast majority of voters, and I think that's
and
Labour's
journalists.
problem. Yeah, and journalists, and I think that's Labour's biggest problem is that outside that kind of Holyrood bubble, people just don't care right now. That's the issue. And somebody like Monica might have injected a bit of star quality, I suppose, a bit of razzmatazz into it, and they're going to be denied that.
So it's now a battle between Marra and Fagan. Marra's a North East MSP. Fagan was elected for the first time to represent South Scotland in May. Both are what you would describe as Labour moderates. They're not on the left. There's not a huge deal separating them in terms of policy. I think Michael Marra will run on the fact that he's got more experience, that he's maybe a more credible leadership figure. Joe Fagan will probably run on the fact that he's not been part of past electoral failures like Michael Marra has, that he's never been part of the Holyrood bubble, even though he did work for an MSP. But following their campaign so far, okay, they admit that their party has received a series of electoral drubbings. Things can't go on the way that they're going on. They don't seem to have a radical prospectus, Dan, for change and actually turning it around.
I think that has been my overriding impression so far. I mean, it's difficult because it's only just started. They've still got plenty of time to set out their stall. But so far, there hasn't really seemed to be any serious policies put forward where you would sort of go, okay, that's something to grab the attention. And, it's one minor point, I suppose, but, one thing that Monica Lennon talks about a little bit is the Constitution, and, we could go round and round as to, whether or not it's the right position or not. We've got Doug Dickie here, I'm sure he'd disagree, but Monica's always been a bit more open to, I guess, broadening out the constitutional question and trying to come up with a way through the never-ending impasse, I suppose. And then, basically the only thing I've seen about Joe Fagan in the last week or so is him saying, no Indy Ref 2 under any circumstances, bish bash boss, the same old line that they've been putting out for years now, and it hasn't really helped them so far. So I hope to be pleasantly surprised during the campaign, and that they're both fizzing full of ideas and policies coming out their ears. But, you sort of strongly doubt it, don't you?
Yeah, look, my take on it is that, it's often said Scottish Labour have lost 5 elections in a row to the SNP, but I think the better point is, the more salient point, is that they deserve to lose all of those elections. The SNP had better leaders, they had policies that connected better with voters, and that was reflected in the results. And now more than ever, Scottish Labour need a no-holds-barred leadership contest that deals with the fundamentals of those defeats, the relationship with the UK party, how to speak to pro-independence voters. Why is it that they've not produced an eye-catching policy in about 20 years? But what we seem to be getting is just a narrowly focused debate on insular Labour concerns that are appealing to about 5,000 people. And as you say, Dan, Joe Fagan's policy on Indy Ref 2, which is a blanket refusal to even consider it, that might play well with the 5,000 people who vote in this contest. But how about the 900,000 folk who voted SNP in May? It's just it completely excludes them. So I think the key thing here is that Scottish Labour need to have a strategy for engaging with and persuading about 50% of the electorate that absolutely hate them and will not even consider voting for them in a Holyrood election. And I just think that this contest, it could have been something, but I think it's going to be business as usual.
I mean, aren't we though? Labour aren't going to out SNP the SNP. That's not how they're going to win. And Paul, we talk about how they're pissing off 50% or whatever. We can argue the toss. What the actual figure is all day. But why would you then, on the flip side, alienate the people that are actually voting for you? Now there might not be many of them, but for every pro-independence voter they might win over by being a bit more lenient on the constitution, they might lose.
What I'm suggesting is that people who vote SNP do so because the SNP have got a radical vision of change, and people know what the SNP stand for. You might disagree with it, you might think independence is a load of old rubbish, but a lot of people subscribe to that. What is Labour's radical vision of change that competes with that? They have to have an alternative to independence that is seen as a cause and a rallying cry to get people to vote, that can then maybe persuade people who vote SNP to actually go Labour. I think that Labour right now, at this moment in time, they are basically a tactical anti-SNP vote. Very few people are actually voting Labour because of a policy perspective or a set of, because of their philosophy. It's to either stop the Tories or to stop the SNP, and there's always going to be a limit on that.
And you can't sort of you can't be more SNP than the SNP, but you also can't be more Tory than the Tories, which is something Labour have also learned in the past. Like, they can't really win. They're either not lenient enough in the constitution, or they get flanked on the other side by the Tories. They've been getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed for years now. And I think Paul's right. I think what they need to do is come up with their own solution to these questions. And voters will listen to exciting prospectuses. If voters are given a reason to care, if they're given something to get excited about, you can see them turn out. But what Labour has been producing, certainly in the last Holyrood election, that manifesto was uninspiring drivel. And I think until you get to a point where they're willing to actually put forward policies that are going to excite people again, they're not going to get anywhere.
Doug, one point just to pick up on you again, Doug, about out SNP and the SNP. So if you take the constituency of Dundee City West at the Holyrood election, which is the one that Michael Marra contested. So the SNP won 12,722 votes. Michael Marra came second with 6,365. So it was a majority of around 6,400, something like that. If he'd managed to get all the votes that Reform had won, the Lib Dems and the Tories, he would have still fallen short. The SNP candidate would still have won. While the SNP are polling 38% in the constituencies nationally, Labour can't win. They're going to have to come up with a way to get some of those voters into their own. And I'm not saying back independence. Yeah. Clearly, Labour are a Union's party. They're never going to do that. But they did it in the general election. They need to find a way of doing it in the Holyrood election as well.
Well, I think Dan's description of their manifesto as uninspiring drivel was being really polite, to be honest. It was absolutely diabolical. And I think their election campaign, and look, I don't think they should soften on the constitution, but they definitely need to offer. I think the biggest problem for me, for Labour at the election, is they didn't offer anything. All they offered was what they weren't, at least in 2024. Now, we all know that it turned out to be, a crock of rubbish, but they at least offered, change. It was that kind of, the idea of change. Labour didn't even offer that at this time. It was just constant. I mean, this sounds incredible for somebody at the Scottish Daily Express to complain about this, but it just felt like it was constant digs at the SNP from Labour without actually. But I think when you're in election mode, you need to provide something more than just having a go at your opponent. You've got to provide an alternative, and Labour have completely failed to do that. Uninspired, and I'm not sure Michael Marra or Joe Fagan. Joe Fagan at least seems a bit spiky. I think, Anis Sauer, quite a mild-mannered guy and very, well thought out. At least Joe Fagan seems like he's got a bit of personality about himself. But and Michael Marra is obviously a competent operator. But, I'm not sure Labour needs either of those two things if they're to kind of eat into that SNP vote right now. They need something. They need to offer something different. They need to offer something new.
Doug, I mean, you've covered Scottish politics for a long time, or you've been interested in it for a long time. Can you remember the last time Scottish Labour at Holyrood level came up with a policy that got people talking?
No. The ban on smoking in pubs. Maybe
that was back in
that's 2 decades.
2006. That's 20 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely.
In school.
Of course, I'm not sure many of the parties out with the SNP, because the SNP are so dominant. I'm not sure many of them have come up with policies that get people talking. I think that's the thing. Holyrood's become a bit of a talking shop in general. I don't think it's just Labour who're guilty of that. But yeah, if you ask someone what Scottish Labour's achievements or ideas have been in the last 2 decades, I think the list's going to be pretty short.
So we're recording this on Wednesday afternoon. There's going to be an STV debate this evening between Michael Marra and Joe Fagan. Not sure how well watched it will be, but I think there's going to be another hustings as well, and the result in the contest will be announced at a special conference in September. I mean, I think it's in all of our interests for Scottish politics to be competitive. We don't want elections where one party just keeps on winning it convincingly. We want a genuine battle of ideas and a bit of rivalry, don't we?
Yeah, and I think as well, if it's not going to be Labour, it's probably going to be Reform, isn't it, who starts to fill that gap and compete with the SNP. And, if that is the future that Labour faces if it doesn't get its act together, being a third wheel to Reform.
Okay, second subject, this prospect of an early general election. Now, Andy Burnham has kind of ruled it out, although I think there's a bit of wiggle room in there. And the reason he's been asked whether he's going to go early is that he's had a decent start. Labour are up in the polls. Reform are down a bit. Farage is struggling, even though he managed to win that by-election. And there's just a feeling that if Labour keep nudging upwards, maybe to about 30%, Burnham might think, look, I'm going to go for it. Dan, I think you're sceptical that there should be or there will be a general election, aren't you?
I think it's fraught with risk. I think, what's his majority at the moment? It's stonking, isn't it? 400 plus?
No, the majority is like over.
Sorry, but
over 100.
Yeah. So they've got a stonking majority, 400 plus seats, and I don't know. It strikes me as you'd have to be fairly reckless or very, very competent to throw that away in pursuit of your own majority or maybe even a bigger majority. I think no one is more competent in their own political talents than Andy Burnham. I think we've seen that, and he's been very good so far. He's spoken a lot of sense. People like him. He's had a good honeymoon period. But this is the thing, honeymoon periods don't last forever. And, we've seen it before in fairly recent history. Theresa May thought she would get a stonking majority. Corbyn was struggling in the polls. But then over the course of a campaign, she got into trouble and she ended up losing the Tory majority then, which was quite a slim majority. And then on the other side, you see, Boris Johnson did kind of pull the same trick and actually win a majority. But it's dicey. You have no idea where the news cycle is going to go over that campaign period. You have no idea what's going to happen. You could be guaranteed the polls will tighten if Labour is substantially ahead by that point. And so, there's a case for either, isn't there? If you have the courage of your convictions, as Burnham did when he stood in Makerfield in the first place, if you have the courage of your convictions and you think you're the guy to take on Reform and win, fair play to you. But let's not pretend that it wouldn't be hugely risky and could actually usher in a Reform government, through the back door, if you like.
Doug, just put Labour goggles on for a second, okay? But just forget that you work for the Scottish Daily Express. If you're looking at it from a Labour perspective, do you think there's a case for an early general?
I think it would need to be absolutely mental to pull the trigger for an early general election. I can't even believe it's been discussed, to be honest, when he's got a majority like that. I mean, I realise, Dan makes the point that he's had a decent honeymoon period, but Dan also rightly makes the point that honeymoons don't last. He's got 2 years of Keir Starmer rubbish behind him to defend. The gap in the polls isn't that much. I know we're talking about maybe if it gets towards 30, but it's certainly not bridgeable. I can't get my head around why anyone would think this is even remotely a good idea. And may I just say, as an extremely tired journalist who's fed up covering elections, the last
I agree
thing
with
I want,
this point. 100% I agree with you at this point.
yeah, the last thing I want to do is have to cover another one so soon after the Holyrood election. But no,
But
when you've got a majority like that in Westminster, I think you still get 3 years. By which time, if he continues to perform well, the Keir Starmer debacle, might have been forgotten by a lot of voters. Reform looked like they might have plateaued. I mean, we'll see. I don't think there's any harm in kind of letting them, see if they can start to draw back a bit. Obviously, the Tories look a wee bit resurgent, but ultimately, I don't think Labour. I think Labour are much happier going up against the Tories than they would be about going up against Reform and both. So I just think it would be. I just can't get my head around that. Absolutely crazy notion. And please don't do it, Andy, because I can't be bothered.
Let me make the case. Let me make the case for this crazy notion. Okay, so they've had a bit of a bump in the polls. I think they'll get another bump. I think he should be plotting and planning for an early general election in 2027, and that is because voters and the electorate are increasingly volatile. I think that the honeymoon is going to end pretty quickly. I think he can prolong it by doing what he's doing, which is rolling out feel-good announcements, cost of living measures. But there are some pretty formidable challenges in his entry that he's going to struggle to deal with in the medium term. That's going to basically result in Labour's poll rating going down. I think Reform would then go up again. I just think the longer he leaves it, for instance, if he was to go for the whole 5 years, I think there's a big chance Reform would win the general election. I think his only chance is to go early, take a hit on that massive majority, and then basically govern for another 5 years after that. I think it's inevitable that whenever we have the general election, Labour are going to go down. But if they go early 2027, I think that they could still end up top of the pile with a majority. That's not going to be popular with Labour MPs who lose their seats, many of whom would be in Scotland. But I think the dangers of waiting to 2028, 2029, we're in Gordon Brown territory here. He bottled it in 2007, and we all know what happened in 2010. So,
but
I agree with you, Doug, that do I personally want a general election? After just covering the Holyrood election, it doesn't fill me with joy, but I think that Downing Street should take it seriously.
I think Gordon Brown had a much... Sorry, Dan.
I was just going to say, would it fill voters with joy? We all remember that video of the woman getting told there was a snap general election, and he goes, "Oh, not another one." I think a lot of people might feel that way. So there is that risk of a backlash by the voters themselves who think, you're just doing this so you can secure your own position. We don't like that. We're gonna show you what for.
I mean, I doubt there'll be much sympathy for us journos because we don't want one. But I mean, I think Dan's right. But also Gordon Brown, I think it was a slightly different situation. We'd had kind of 10 years of New Labour. I know Iraq was kind of in the background, but on the whole, things were pretty good at home. People felt like the pound in their pocket was stretching further. We were still a year out from the credit crunch. So whereas it's a completely different situation right now, coming off the back, 2 years of really dismal government for Keir Starmer. People don't feel better off. They feel they've been shortchanged. So I don't think the two situations are comparable. But I take on board what you're saying, Paul. But I mean,
I've been outvoted. It's 2-1. There's not going to be a general election. So.
You made a good case for it, Paul. Actually, I was almost getting there. Actually,
Thank you. Okay, so let's just move on quickly to the final issue. There was a BBC Disclosure a documentary, which was, the whole gist of it was they were filming in the city centre for a week in June to capture the increasing lawlessness in Glasgow. And I'll just read out a few paragraphs from the BBC report. It says, "We captured people openly dealing and taking drugs, as well as thefts, arrests, and even a brawl involving young men throwing traffic cones at a man with a dog. A taxi driver who regularly drives into the area told us so many people were off their head on drugs and that it was sometimes like the zombie apocalypse. And a convenience store manager said he was racially abused at least 20 times a day and his shop was under constant attack from drug addicts." Doug, it was a pretty grim documentary. And I think for many Glaswegians who lament the decline of their city centre, they'll be really depressed when they watch this, but they won't be surprised. Who do you blame for this state of affairs?
Well, I mean, obviously the SNP run council, I think have neglected, these issues. They've kind of ignored these issues as they've been rising up. But there's no doubt, obviously, there's a wee bit of nostalgia tinged glasses on. I remember the city in its kind of late 90s, early 90s heyday. It's completely different from then. We've crunched the numbers. There's no doubt at all that crime is increasing in Glasgow over the past few years. The numbers are there. I know some people have voted to kind of shoot down this documentary. People clearly have worries. I do think some of it's maybe been a bit overblown. I always take a taxi driver's word with a pinch of salt, if I'm being honest. But I think part of it comes back. I've got this really mad theory, which I'm just going to share. I think it's something to do with the People Make Glasgow slogan. I think people have bought into that to the extent that they don't think that they had to do anything else with the city because, if the people make the city, then we don't actually need to do anything with it. It's just your average Glaswegian. I mean, Glasgow's always been quite a rough city. It's kind of forgotten that. Murder capital of Europe at one point. And I think there's a feeling here that it's kind of put itself on a pedestal, Glasgow, over the years, when the truth is it's always been all right. It's always been good. It's probably not the best city in the world. I know a lot of these issues, you see them in big cities, but I wouldn't say Glasgow is a particularly big city. It's kind of middling. Geographically, it's quite small. And I think that's one of the biggest problems Glasgow faces, is that these problems manifest themselves right in the city centre. So they're very, very visible, where in other cities, they're maybe a bit more on the fringes, but everyone notices it in Glasgow. And anyone who's walked down Union Street or walked down, walked through St. Square, walked under Central Bridge, the Hillman's umbrella, in the past few years, you just can't help but notice the utter decline. And ultimately, I think responsibility needs to lie with the city council. I don't think the police have helped either. I think the police should take a more zero tolerance approach. I know they've got a dispersal zone, but I'm not quite sure how much of a deterrent that really is. But ultimately, I think the responsibility lies with the city council.
Just very briefly, Dan, what are your reflections on it? I mean, was it a misrepresentation of Glasgow, or do you think that it was a long overdue documentary?
I actually have to agree with Doug on this one and say that it was a fair documentary. I mean, we went out, Sunday Mail went out in February to do a feature about homelessness, and it was me who went out with a photographer, and it was absolute carnage. A woman I was interviewing at one point underneath the Hillman's umbrella. I'm not sure anyone actually calls it that in the city, but we found some tents under the central station, interviewed some people there. One of the women then sprinted off to a fight, came back and told us she just got punched in the face. And I was just the whole time wondering, where on earth are the police? And that was just one example of many we found of people sleeping rough, people taking drugs. So many stories of people dying in the streets of overdoses. Never mind the violence. Something's gone wrong. We were the murder capital of Europe back in 2003, whenever it was, and then we managed to turn things around. But clearly, things are going in the wrong direction again, and all the plaudits we got for our good work, we're losing that, and we need to get a grip on it. It's not unique to Glasgow; it's happening in other cities. I think in general, there's a problem with disorder at the moment. There's a problem with police resources. There's problems with poverty. There's lots of problems. But this is what's going to happen, and this is going to happen more and more if we don't get a grip of those problems.
All right, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks very much to Dan and to Doug for joining me, and thanks also to Paul from the Records video team who produced this episode. You can listen to Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or watch it on the Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.